The screaming began at 8:30 on the evening of June 17, 1841. Not the kind of screaming that punctuated daily life on Dunridge plantation, not the crack of the whip followed by obligatory cries, not the wailing of mothers separated from children at auction, not even the howls of field hands collapsing under the merciless Georgia sun. This was different. This was the sound of white men dying. The first scream tore across the cotton fields like a knife through silk, high, desperate, disbelieving. It came from the direction of the cotton shed, that massive timber structure that squatted 50 yards east of the manor house, its roof peaked like a church though nothing holy had ever happened within its walls. The second scream followed, lower, more guttural, the sound of a man who understood what was happening to him and could not accept it. Then came the third voice, joining the chorus in perfect, hideous harmony. From the slave quarters, 43 souls stood frozen in the June twilight, listening. They knew those voices. Master Cornelius Dunridge. His brother Wade. Overseer Jessup Calloway. The three men who had ruled their lives with fists and leather and casual cruelty for as long as memory served. And now those men were screaming like slaughtered hogs. No one moved. No one ran to help. They simply stood and listened as the screams escalated, as they transformed from words, "Help! God! Please!" into something primitive and wordless, the sounds animals make when they understand the predator has them by the throat. Inside the cotton shed, the air had become hell itself. Smoke rolled in thick gray waves against the rafters, carrying with it the smell of burning cotton, sweet and acrid simultaneously, mixed with something else, something that made the stomach clench and revolt. The fire pit at the shed center roared like a living beast, fed by lamp oil and kindling and cotton waste, its flames reaching 6 feet high and casting writhing shadows against walls lined with compressed cotton bales. The heat was suffocating, transforming the wooden structure into an oven. Master Cornelius Dunridge pressed himself against the far wall, his fine linen shirt soaked through with sweat and blood, his manicured hands clawing at the timber planks as if he could tear through them by will alone. His face, that face that had sneered and smiled and condemned so many to suffering, was now a mask of animal terror, eyes wide and white in the firelight, mouth open in a continuous scream that had shredded his vocal cords to ribbons. Smoke filled his lungs with each desperate breath, and he coughed black phlegm onto his shirt front. "Tobias," he shrieked, the name barely intelligible through the smoke and flames. "Tobias, please. I'll give you anything. Freedom. Money. Your wife, you can have her freedom. Your family. Tobias." But Tobias Huckwell was no longer inside the shed. He stood outside, his dark hands pressed against the timber planks he'd wedged across the door, barring it shut. His shoulder throbbed where Jessup Calloway's knife had opened a 4-inch gash before Tobias had ended him. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and sticky, but he barely noticed. His entire being was focused on keeping that door closed, on feeling the vibrations through the wood as three men threw themselves against it again and again, their combined weight insufficient to budge the heavy planks. Orange firelight leaked through gaps in the shed's walls, illuminating Tobias's face in flickering intervals. His expression was not one of rage or triumph or savage joy. It was blank. Completely, utterly blank. As if everything that made him human, every emotion, every mercy, every trace of the man he'd been, had been carefully excised, leaving behind only terrible purpose. His lips moved, forming words no one could hear over the roar of flames and screams: Bess. Miriam. Elijah. Samuel. Rebecca. Bess. 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 The names of the dead and broken. The names of those stolen and sold and destroyed. A litany. A prayer. A justification. Inside, Wade Dunridge had stopped running. He lay near the fire pit, his legs shattered, dragging himself inch by agonizing inch toward the door with his arms. His fine traveling coat smoldered, small flames dancing along the wool. He'd been handsome once, the kind of handsome that let him take what he wanted from slave women without consequence, the kind that made him think himself untouchable. Now his face was a ruin of burns and soot, one eye swollen shut, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "Brother," he gasped, reaching toward Cornelius. "Brother, help me. Help me. I don't want to die. I don't." The flames found the lamp oil Tobias had splashed across the floor in preparation. Fire exploded outward in a wave, engulfing Wade Dunridge mid-sentence. His scream reached a pitch that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce, a sound that would echo in the nightmares of every soul who heard it for the rest of their days. Jessup Calloway had already stopped moving. He lay half in, half out of the fire pit itself, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, smoke rising from his clothes and hair. His eyes were open but seeing nothing, his mouth frozen in a final expression of disbelief. He'd been a poor white man who'd found his only source of pride and power in brutalizing those deemed lower than himself. Now he was meat and ash. Cornelius abandoned the wall and threw himself at the door one final time. The impact shook the entire structure. Tobias felt it through the planks, felt the desperate strength of a man facing his final moments. The door held. Of course it held. Tobias had planned for this, had tested every timber, had ensured there would be no escape. "You demon!" Cornelius's voice cracked, barely audible now over the fire's roar. "You'll hang for this. They'll hang you slow. They'll make you watch your wife die first. You're whole." A coughing fit interrupted him, violent and wet. When he spoke again, his voice had diminished to a whisper. "Why? I gave you everything. House position. Extra rations. I was good to you." Tobias's blank expression finally cracked. His lips pulled back from his teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite a snarl. He leaned close to the door, close enough that Cornelius might hear him through the wood and flame. "You took my daughter," Tobias said, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "You promised she could stay. You sold her anyway. For $800. She died 3 weeks later. She was 11 years old." Silence from inside, except for the hungry crackle of flames consuming timber and cotton and flesh. "I gave you everything," Cornelius whispered, and perhaps he genuinely believed it. "You gave me nothing," Tobias replied. "You owned nothing to give. It was all stolen." The roof timbers began to crack, loud reports like rifle shots. Sparks fountained into the night sky, visible now to the gathering crowd of house slaves and field hands who'd crept closer despite their fear. They formed a semicircle in the darkness, their faces illuminated by the burning shed, their expressions unreadable. Cornelius Dunridge's screaming stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door. Whether smoke or flames or simply the surrender of his body to the inevitable had silenced him, no one could say. But the silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming had been. Tobias Huckwell stepped back from the door. His legs trembled, threatening to give out, and he locked his knees to stay upright. Blood dripped from his shoulder wound, pattering onto the dry Georgia earth. The shed blazed before him, a cathedral of fire, and somewhere in that inferno were 3 men who would never hurt anyone again. He turned and walked toward the gathered slaves. They parted before him without a word, their eyes following his every step. Miriam stood at the edge of the crowd, his wife of 16 years, her face wet with tears that reflected the firelight. He stopped before her but did not touch her. Did not speak. Simply looked at her with those blank, hollowed-out eyes. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I know why." Behind them, the cotton shed's roof collapsed inward with a sound like the earth splitting open, sending a pillar of sparks and embers high into the night sky. The heat wave washed over them all, carrying with it the smell of death and burning and the end of something that could never be rebuilt. Tobias Huckwell did not look back. He let Miriam lead him toward the slave quarters, his feet moving automatically, his mind somewhere else entirely. Somewhere 6 months in the past, perhaps. Or somewhere 3 weeks ago, in Alabama, in a fever dream beside a grave too small for the body it held. The flames burned through the night. By morning, the cotton shed would be nothing but blackened timbers and ash and 3 sets of charred bones that the coroner would need to identify by their positions and the metal buckles on their belts. But to understand how Tobias Huckwell became a killer, how a house slave who polished silver and served meals transformed into the man who burned 3 white men alive, we must go back 6 months. Back to the cold morning in January 1841 when everything changed. Back to when Tobias still believed that dignity and obedience might save the people he loved. Back to the beginning of the end. January 1841 arrived at Dunridge plantation with frost on the cotton stubble and ice crystallizing in the water buckets outside the slave quarters. Tobias Huckwell woke before dawn, as he had every day for 34 years, his body responding to rhythms beaten into it since childhood. The kitchen floor where he slept was cold against his back, but the warmth from the banked cooking fire kept him from shivering. Small mercies. A house slave learned to be grateful for small mercies. He rose silently, careful not to wake the cook, Auntie May, who slept in the small room off the kitchen. His pallet, a thin mattress stuffed with corn husks, went into the corner cupboard where it stayed during the day, invisible, as if he himself vanished when not needed. He splashed icy water on his face from the basin, dressed in his house livery, a gray wool shirt, black trousers without patches, shoes with soles that weren't worn through, and began his morning duties. First, the silver. Master Cornelius Dunridge insisted on polished silver at every meal, even breakfast. Tobias laid out each piece on the kitchen table, spoons, forks, knives with bone handles, the coffee service, the sugar tongs, and worked methodically with the polishing cloth and paste. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, hands that had been doing this since he was 8 years old, since the old master's daughter, Miss Caroline, had taken pity on him and brought him into the house. Miss Caroline. Dead now these 5 years, consumption taking her before her 30th birthday. She'd taught him his letters in secret, let him read from her books when no one was watching. "You have a quick mind, Tobias," she told him once. "In a different world, you could have been anything." But this was not a different world. This was Spalding County, Georgia, where Dunridge plantation sprawled across 800 acres of cotton fields, where 217 souls labored under the ownership of Cornelius Dunridge, and where Tobias Huckwell, property, chattel, valued at approximately $1,200 according to the ledgers he'd glimpsed, polished silver and kept his quick mind carefully hidden behind a mask of humble servitude. "Morning, Tobias." Auntie May emerged from her room, her gray hair wrapped in a faded blue cloth. She was 60 if she was a day, had survived 3 owners and countless overseers. Her survival strategy was simple: cook well, keep silent, become invisible. Master want his breakfast at 7 sharp. Eggs, ham, grits, biscuits. His brother arriving today from Charleston. "Yes, ma'am." Tobias never called her Auntie aloud, though everyone else did. It felt too familiar, too warm for the careful distance he maintained from everyone except Miriam and Bess. Distance kept you safe. Distance kept you from breaking when the people you loved were sold away. By 6:30, the manor house began to wake. Tobias moved through the downstairs rooms, parlor, dining room, study, opening curtains, stoking fires, ensuring everything met Master Cornelius's exacting standards. The house was grand by plantation standards: 2 stories of whitewashed timber, tall windows with real glass, carpets from Philadelphia, furniture carved from mahogany and cherry wood. Built on the backs of people who would never own so much as the clothes they wore. Master Cornelius descended the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock. He was 42, running to fat around the middle, with thinning brown hair he combed carefully over his balding crown. His face had the ruddy complexion of a man who drank whiskey every evening and wine with every meal. He wore expensive clothes, a burgundy waistcoat, gray trousers, a pocket watch on a gold chain, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been denied anything in his entire life. Tobias. He didn't look at him, never looked directly at slaves unless he was angry. My brother Wade arrives this afternoon. Guest room prepared? Yes, Master Cornelius. Fresh linens, fire laid, water pitcher filled. Good. He'll be here a week, maybe 2. Wants to see how we run things, thinking of expanding his own operation in South Carolina. Cornelius settled into his chair at the head of the dining table. I expect perfect service. Wade is particular about such things. Yes, Master Cornelius. Tobias served breakfast with the silent efficiency expected of him, placing dishes just so, pouring coffee at the precise temperature, anticipating needs before they were spoken. He stood against the wall afterward, hands clasped behind his back, eyes unfocused, becoming furniture. This was survival. This was how a house slave endured. Through the window, he could see the field hands beginning their day's labor, moving in long lines through the winter-bare cotton fields, preparing the soil for spring planting. Somewhere among them was Miriam, his wife, assigned to the weaving house where she turned raw cotton into cloth. They'd been married 16 years, since he was 18 and she was 16, married in the slave way with jumped broom and spoken vows that had no legal standing but meant everything anyway. And Bess. Their daughter. 11 years old, bright-eyed and quick like her father, gentle like her mother. She worked in the main house too, cleaning chambers and helping in the laundry. Master Cornelius had promised, that she could stay in the house, that she wouldn't be sent to the fields when she got older. That she wouldn't be sold away. If you're intrigued by this dark chapter of history, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our macabre tales. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Wade Dunridge arrived in a carriage pulled by 2 matched bay horses. Tobias stood on the front porch with Master Cornelius, ready to handle luggage and assist as needed. He watched Wade step down from the carriage and felt something cold move through his chest. Wade Dunridge was 38, 4 years younger than his brother, and where Cornelius had gone soft with comfortable living, Wade remained lean and hard. He had dark hair, darker eyes, and a smile that never reached past his lips. He wore traveling clothes, a black coat, high boots, a hat with a wide brim, and carried himself like a man who enjoyed his power. Cornelius. Wade embraced his brother, then stepped back and surveyed the plantation with an appraising eye. Fine property. Very fine. Father would be proud of what you've built here. He'd be proud of both his sons, Cornelius replied, clapping Wade on the shoulder. Come inside. We'll have brandy and you can tell me about your cotton yields this season. Wade's eyes swept over Tobias with the same appraising look he'd given the property. This your house boy? Tobias, yes. Had him since he was a child. Well trained, quiet, knows his place. I can see that. Wade smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Tobias's skin crawl. You're fortunate, Cornelius. Good house servants are difficult to find. Most of them get ideas above their station, start thinking they're something they're not. Not Tobias. Cornelius waved dismissively. He knows better. His wife and daughter work here too, gives him incentive to behave, if you understand me. Wade's smile widened. I understand perfectly. Tobias carried Wade's luggage upstairs, feeling those dark eyes following him the entire time. He'd met men like Wade before, men who found entertainment in cruelty, who invented reasons to punish because they enjoyed the spectacle. Overseers were often such men, poor whites who compensated for their own low status by brutalizing those even lower. But Wade Dunridge wasn't poor. He didn't need to prove anything. Which meant his cruelty came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. That evening, Tobias served dinner to the 2 brothers and tried not to listen to their conversation. Tried not to hear Wade's stories about his plantation in Charleston, about the slave he'd had whipped for looking at him wrong, about the woman he'd sold away from her children for refusing his advances, about the boy he'd had locked in the sweat box for 3 days during summer for dropping a water pitcher. Cornelius laughed at these stories. Actually laughed, his red face growing redder with each glass of wine. "You always were harder than me, Wade," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "I'm too soft-hearted, that's my problem. Let them get away with too much. Softness is weakness, brother. They're animals, intelligent animals, I'll grant you, but animals nonetheless. You show them an inch of mercy, they'll take a mile and cut your throat with it." Tobias's hands trembled as he poured more wine, a slight tremor he couldn't quite control. Neither man noticed. Why would they? He was furniture. He was nothing. After dinner, he returned to the slave quarters to see Miriam and Bess. They lived in a small cabin they shared with 2 other families, cramped, drafty, with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls that let in winter wind. But it was theirs, in the way that nothing could truly be theirs. Miriam was mending clothes by candlelight when he entered. She looked up, and her smile, God, her smile still made his heart ache after all these years. Bess sat beside her, practicing letters on a slate with a piece of chalk Tobias had stolen from the manor house. "Papa." Bess jumped up and hugged him. "Look, I can write my whole name now. BSS, Mama taught me." "That's wonderful, sweet girl." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the smell of lye soap and childhood. "But remember." "I know, Papa. Only practice here, never where anyone can see." She returned to her slate, tongue poking out in concentration. Tobias sat beside Miriam on the low bench. She took his hand, her fingers rough from weaving but gentle in their touch. "The brother arrived?" she asked quietly. "Yes. And he's worse than Cornelius. Much worse." Miriam's hand tightened on his. "We'll manage. We always do." But Tobias wasn't so sure. Something felt different this time, some instinct honed by years of survival sending warning signals he couldn't quite name. He looked at Bess, bent over her slate, her young face serious with concentration, and felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Miriam," he said softly. "If anything ever happens." "Nothing will happen." She squeezed his hand again, fierce now. "We're together. We're safe. Master Cornelius promised Bess could stay. We just have to keep our heads down and endure. That's all we've ever done. That's all we can do." Tobias wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that promises from men like Cornelius Dunridge meant anything. Wanted to believe that keeping his head down and enduring would be enough to protect the people he loved. But deep down, in a place he didn't let himself acknowledge, he was beginning to understand that endurance had limits. That dignity and obedience wouldn't save anyone. That the careful mask he wore, the distance he maintained, the small mercies he counted, none of it would matter when men like Wade Dunridge decided to remind everyone exactly who held the power. Outside, the January wind howled through gaps in the cabin walls. Inside, Tobias held his wife's hand and watched his daughter practice writing her name, and tried not to think about the future. He failed. Wade Dunridge had been at the plantation for 3 days when the whipping happened. It was mid-morning, the kind of February day where the Georgia sun burned off the frost but provided no real warmth. Tobias was polishing boots in the mud room when he heard Master Cornelius's voice calling from the front porch, sharp and commanding. "Tobias! Out here! Now!" He set down the brush and walked outside, his face carefully neutral despite the anxiety that immediately began crawling up his spine. Master Cornelius only used that tone when something was wrong, when someone needed to be punished, when an example needed to be made. On the front lawn, a scene had been arranged like a grotesque theater. Master Cornelius stood with Wade and a third man Tobias recognized immediately, Jessup Calloway, the plantation's overseer. Calloway was 35, rail-thin and weathered, with sun-damaged skin and pale blue eyes that never blinked enough. He'd been born poor white trash in Alabama, worked his way up from field hand supervisor through sheer viciousness. His reputation preceded him. He'd killed 2 slaves on his previous plantation, claimed both were accidents, was never charged because dead slaves weren't worth the paperwork. Between the 3 white men stood Elijah, a field hand Tobias knew from the quarters. Elijah was 19, strong and capable, with a wife and infant son. His hands were bound behind his back with rope. His face was already swelling on one side, evidence of blows already delivered. Tobias, Cornelius said, his voice carrying that false pleasantness that meant danger. This boy Elijah was caught stealing bread from the cookhouse. Bold as brass, walked right in and took it. Tobias said nothing. Silence was safety. Master Calloway here says 20 lashes ought to teach him. But my brother Wade, Cornelius gestured to Wade, who smiled that smile that never reached his eyes. Wade thinks that's too lenient. Says a slave doing the whipping makes it sting more, makes the lesson stick better. Shame is a powerful teacher, he says. The cold weight in Tobias's chest became ice. So you're going to administer the punishment, Tobias. 20 lashes. And you'll do them properly, with force. Because if Calloway here thinks you're going easy, if he thinks you're not putting your back into it, then we'll add another 20 and you can watch what a real whipping looks like. Tobias looked at Elijah. The young man's eyes met his, wide with fear but also understanding. They both knew there was no choice here, no way out. Refusal meant worse punishment for both of them. Mercy meant prolonged suffering. Wade Dunridge stepped forward, holding the whip, 10 feet of braided leather with a popper at the end designed to break skin. He held it out to Tobias like a gift. Go on, Wade said softly. Show us you know your place, houseboy. Tobias took the whip. His hands didn't shake. He couldn't afford to let them shake. Jessup Calloway dragged Elijah to the whipping post, a thick timber sunk deep into the ground for exactly this purpose, and tied his bound wrists to the iron ring bolted at the top. Elijah's shirt was torn away, exposing his back. Already scarred from previous whippings, a map of old pain. Count them out, Cornelius ordered. Nice and loud so we can all hear. Tobias stepped back, measuring the distance. He'd seen this done countless times but never administered it himself. House slaves were usually spared this particular duty, kept clean and presentable. But Wade Dunridge wanted humiliation, wanted to see the mask crack, wanted to turn Tobias into the instrument of another man's suffering. He drew back the whip and let it fly. The crack echoed across the lawn. Elijah's back split open, a line of red blooming instantly. He jerked against the post but didn't cry out. One, Tobias said, his voice flat and empty. Again. The whip sang through the air, leather meeting flesh with that distinctive wet sound. 2. Elijah's breath came in gasps now. Blood began to run down his back in rivulets. 3. By the 10th lash, Elijah was sobbing. By the 15th, he was screaming. By the 20th, he hung limp against the post, held up only by the rope binding his wrists, his back a ruined mess of split skin and exposed muscle. Tobias lowered the whip. His arm ached. Elijah's blood spattered his shirt and face. He felt nothing. He felt everything. He felt himself splitting into pieces, the part that held the whip and the part that watched from somewhere far away, the part that survived and the part that died a little more with each crack of leather against flesh. Well done, Wade said, taking the whip back. See, Cornelius. A slave disciplining another slave, it maintains order, keeps them from getting ideas about solidarity. Pit them against each other and you'll never face rebellion. Cornelius nodded approvingly. Cut him down, Calloway. Send him back to the fields when he can stand. And Tobias, clean yourself up. You look a mess. Tobias turned and walked back to the house, his legs moving automatically while his mind screamed. Behind him, he heard Elijah being cut down, heard the thud as his unconscious body hit the ground. That night, lying beside Miriam in their cabin, Tobias stared at the ceiling and listened to her cry. She'd heard what happened, everyone in the quarters had heard. News traveled fast in a community where information was survival. You had no choice, she whispered, her hand on his chest. You did what you had to do. Elijah knows that. Everyone knows that. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. Didn't wash Elijah's blood from his hands, even though he'd scrubbed them raw in the kitchen basin. Didn't erase the memory of that whip in his palm, the weight of it, the way it felt to become the instrument of another man's pain. They're testing me, Tobias said quietly. Wade especially. He wants to see how far he can push, where I'll break. Then don't break. Miriam's voice was fierce despite her tears. Don't give him the satisfaction. We've survived worse than him. But had they? Tobias wasn't sure anymore. 3 weeks later, the second incident occurred. Master Cornelius was hosting a dinner party, 8 guests from neighboring plantations, men of property and standing, their wives in silk dresses and jewels. Tobias served as he always did, moving between courses with practiced grace, pouring wine, clearing plates, invisible until needed. Wade Dunridge had been drinking steadily all evening, his face flushed and eyes too bright. He watched Tobias move through the dining room with an attention that set every nerve on edge. You know, Cornelius, Wade said during a lull in conversation, I've been meaning to tell you, this house boy of yours is getting above himself. The dinner table went quiet. Cornelius set down his fork, frowning. How so? The way he carries himself. Too upright, too dignified. Like he thinks he's a butler in some fine house instead of property. It's disrespectful. Wade leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass. He needs to be reminded of his station. Tobias stood against the wall, hands clasped behind his back, face blank. Inside, that cold weight turned to dread. I hadn't noticed, Cornelius said slowly, looking at Tobias now with reassessing eyes. He's always been well behaved. That's the problem, he behaves like he's doing you a favor, like he chooses to serve. That's pride, brother. And pride in a slave is dangerous. Wade smiled. I have an idea. A lesson that won't damage him physically but will certainly adjust his attitude. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying this story. The lesson Wade devised was simple and devastating. After the guests had eaten their dessert of apple pie and cream, after the ladies had retired to the parlor and the men had moved to the study for brandy and cigars, Wade called Tobias in. We have a mess to clean up in the dining room, Wade said, his tone pleasant. But first, I want to show our guests how well trained your servants are, Cornelius. He produced a dog bowl, an actual ceramic bowl painted with bones and the words, good boy, and set it on the floor. Then he scraped the leftover scraps from dinner into it, congealed gravy, bits of gristle and fat, half-chewed bread, all mixed together into a disgusting slurry. Tobias here is going to eat his dinner, Wade announced. On his hands and knees, like the good boy he is. No hands, just face in the bowl, like any dog would eat. The study fell silent. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat as if to object, then thought better of it. Cornelius laughed nervously. Wade, that's necessary, Wade interrupted, his voice harder now. He needs to understand his place. They all do. Now, Tobias, on the floor. Tobias looked at Master Cornelius, a silent plea in his eyes. Cornelius looked away. There was no choice. There was never a choice. Tobias knelt beside the dog bowl. The degradation was total, absolute. He'd been whipped before, all slaves were whipped eventually. But this was different. This was designed to destroy something inside him, to take whatever dignity he'd managed to preserve and grind it into the floor. He bent his head and ate from the bowl, tasting nothing but humiliation. The white men watched. Some laughed. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Wade Dunridge watched with obvious satisfaction, sipping his brandy. When the bowl was empty, Wade patted Tobias on the head like a pet. "Good boy," he said. "See how easy it is when they know their place." Tobias was dismissed. He walked back to the kitchen on legs that barely held him, his face burning with shame, his stomach roiling with the cold, rancid food he'd forced down. In the kitchen, he vomited it all back up into the slop bucket, then sank to his knees on the cold floor and wept silently, his body shaking with the effort of keeping the sobs trapped in his chest. That night, he didn't go to the quarters. Couldn't face Miriam, couldn't let her see him like this. He lay on his pallet in the dark kitchen and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The mask he'd worn for 34 years, the careful servility, the strategic invisibility, the dignity maintained through sheer force of will, had cracked. And in the space where it cracked, something else began to grow. Not rage, exactly. Rage was hot and loud and uncontrolled. This was colder. Quieter. A crystalline clarity about the nature of his existence, about the fundamental truth that no amount of obedience would ever be enough, that mercy from men like Wade Dunridge and Cornelius and Jessup Calloway was a fantasy. He'd lived his entire life trying to survive through submission. But submission only invited greater cruelty. Dignity only provoked more degradation. Tobias Huckwell lay in the dark and began, for the first time in his life, to truly consider the alternative. The alternative looked like blood and fire and 3 men who would never hurt anyone again. April arrived at Dunridge Plantation with dogwood blossoms and the choking humidity that presaged Georgia's brutal summer. The cotton plants were 6 inches high in the fields, tender green shoots that would grow waist-high by July, white bowls bursting open by September. The cycle continued as it always had, season after season, generation after generation, built on the backs of people who would never profit from a single bowl they picked. Tobias moved through his duties with mechanical precision, his mask rebuilt but thinner now, more fragile. He polished silver. He served meals. He stood against walls and became furniture. But something had shifted in the way he observed the world around him. He was no longer simply enduring, he was studying. Noting patterns. Watching movements. Calculating. Wade Dunridge had extended his visit indefinitely. He'd decided to stay through the growing season, to learn from his brother's operation, though everyone knew the real reason. Wade enjoyed himself here. Enjoyed the power, the casual cruelty, the entertainment that came from tormenting people who couldn't fight back. Jessup Calloway had taken to Wade immediately. The 2 men had formed an alliance of sorts, united by their shared philosophy that slaves needed constant reminding of their subordinate status. They spent long evenings in the cotton shed, drinking whiskey and conducting business, selling excess cotton to merchants, discussing purchases of new slaves, and planning the harvest season's logistics. The cotton shed. Tobias had begun paying attention to the cotton shed. It was a massive structure, 50 yards from the main house, built from thick timber planks with a peaked roof and a single large entrance. Inside, compressed cotton bales were stacked along the walls, waiting for transport to market. At the center of the shed stood a brick fire pit, 6 feet in diameter, used for burning cotton waste, the bowls too damaged for processing, the debris that accumulated during ginning, trash that needed disposal. Tobias had noticed that Cornelius, Wade, and Jessup met there at least 3 evenings a week. They preferred it to the house for their business dealings, cooler in the evening heat, private, with enough space to examine cotton samples and conduct negotiations. They'd light the fire pit for visibility, the flames casting dancing shadows against the walls. He'd noticed other things too. The shed had only one entrance. The door opened outward. Heavy timber planks leaned against the exterior wall, used for repairs. The fire pit could be stoked to tremendous heat when fed enough fuel. The cotton bales lining the walls were dry and flammable. These observations lived in a part of Tobias's mind he didn't examine too closely yet. They were simply facts, catalogued and stored away for no particular reason. Or so he told himself. On the morning of May 24, 1841, everything changed. Tobias was sweeping the front porch when he saw the rider approaching, a young white man on a tired horse, dusty from travel. The man dismounted and asked for Master Cornelius. Tobias fetched him from the study. "Letter for you, sir," the rider said, handing over a sealed envelope. "From Alabama." The sender paid extra for express delivery. Cornelius tipped the rider and dismissed him, then broke the seal. Tobias stood nearby, waiting in case he was needed, not really paying attention until he heard Cornelius mutter, "Shame." The girl was young too. Something in Tobias's chest constricted. "What's that?" Wade asked, emerging from the dining room. "Letter from Thaddeus Morrison over in Montgomery. Remember I sold him that slave girl, the house slave's daughter, back in February? She's died. Fever, apparently. Lasted less than 3 months." Cornelius shrugged. "Well, these things happen. At least Morrison can't claim I sold him damaged goods, she was healthy when she left here." The world tilted. Tobias's vision narrowed to a single point, the letter in Cornelius's hand, the casual words, the dismissive shrug. Bess. His daughter. His 11-year-old daughter who practiced writing her name by candlelight, who hugged him when he came to the quarters, who had his quick mind and Miriam's gentle heart. Bess, who he'd been promised would stay at Dunridge, who Cornelius had sworn wouldn't be sold. "She's dead." The words came out before Tobias could stop them, barely more than a whisper but loud enough to shatter the invisible wall between slave and master. Cornelius looked at him, surprised that furniture had spoken. Then his expression hardened. "Yes, she's dead. And you'll keep a civil tongue in your head when addressing me, boy. You forget yourself. You promised." Tobias's voice was still quiet, but something in it made Wade's head snap around, made Jessup Calloway, who just walked in from outside, pause in the doorway. "You promised she could stay. You sold her anyway." "I sold her because I needed the capital for spring planting, and because I'll be damned if I'll explain my business decisions to property." Cornelius's face flushed red. "Now get back to your duties before I have Calloway teach you some manners." Tobias stood frozen. He could feel it happening, the mask cracking, the careful control splintering. 34 years of suppressed rage and grief and humiliation pressing against his ribs like a living thing trying to claw its way out. "You killed her," he said. "You sold her to a stranger 300 miles away and she died alone and afraid and you killed her." Wade moved first, striking Tobias across the face with the back of his hand. The blow snapped Tobias's head to the side, split his lip. He tasted blood. "You need to learn your place," Wade said, his voice low and dangerous. "Calloway, take him out back. 20 lashes ought to remind him who he belongs to." But Jessup Calloway had gone very still, studying Tobias with those pale eyes that never blinked enough. "Mr. Wade," he said slowly, "begging your pardon, but I don't think lashing is what's needed here." "Oh." Wade raised an eyebrow. "This one's broke something inside. I can see it. He's gone past fear." Calloway stepped closer to Tobias, close enough that Tobias could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You lash a slave who's past fear, all you do is give him nothing left to lose. That's when they get dangerous. So what do you suggest?" Cornelius asked, clearly unnerved by Tobias's stillness, by the way he stood there bleeding and silent and utterly, terribly calm. "Lock him in the root cellar for 3 days. No food, minimum water. Let him think about things in the dark. Break his spirit without breaking his body, you need him functional for house duties." Calloway smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. 3 days alone in the dark does things to a man's mind. He'll come out grateful for the light, grateful to serve. They dragged Tobias to the root cellar, a stone chamber dug into the ground behind the kitchen, used for storing vegetables and preserves. They threw him down the ladder and bolted the door, leaving him in absolute darkness. 3 days. For the first day, Tobias raged. He beat his fists against the stone walls until they bled. He screamed until his voice gave out. He wept for Bess, for the daughter he'd never see again, never hold again, never watch grow into the remarkable woman she should have become. By the second day, the rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something colder and harder. In the darkness, Tobias's mind began to work with crystalline clarity. He thought about the cotton shed. About patterns of movement. About 3 men who met there regularly. About fire and timber and the way sound echoed inside that wooden structure. By the 3rd day, he'd made his decision. When they pulled him out of the root cellar on the morning of the 4th day, blinking in the painful sunlight, Tobias Huckwell had become someone else. Not broken, transformed. The mask he put back on was perfect, flawless, the most convincing performance of his life. He bowed his head and apologized to Master Cornelius. He promised better behavior. He thanked them for the lesson. They believed him because they wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that a slave might be capable of sophisticated deception, of planning, of cold calculation, was too threatening to their worldview. Tobias returned to his duties. He polished silver. He served meals. He stood against walls. But now, every action had purpose. Every observation fed into a growing plan. He began preparing in small, invisible ways. He took rope from the storage shed, a coil at a time, hiding it in the cotton shed behind the bales where no one would notice. He added extra kindling to the fire pit area during his regular duties, casually, as if simply being helpful. He tested the shed door when no one was watching, noted how the hinges worked, how much force it would take to bar it from outside. He learned their schedule. Cornelius, Wade, and Jessup met in the cotton shed every Tuesday and Thursday evening, around 8 o'clock. They stayed for 2 to 3 hours, drinking whiskey and conducting business. They always came together, never separately. They always entered through the single door. In the quarters at night, Tobias held Miriam while she grieved for Bess. She wept into his chest and he stroked her hair and said nothing about the plan forming in his mind. Some things couldn't be shared, not even with her. Especially not with her. What he intended to do would end only one way, with him dead on a rope. He couldn't let her be complicit, couldn't risk them punishing her for his actions. "I can't survive this," Miriam whispered one night. "Losing Bess, I can't." "You can," Tobias said quietly. "You will. You're stronger than you know. How do you stay so calm? How are you not?" She pulled back to look at his face in the darkness. "Tobias, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about survival," he said, which was technically true. "I'm thinking about enduring. That's all we can do." She believed him because she needed to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. We're approaching the horrifying conclusion. Make sure you're subscribed so you can hear more stories like this one. May turned to June. The cotton plants grew taller. The Georgia heat became oppressive, the kind of heat that made men seek shade in cooler buildings in the evening. The cotton shed, with its high ceiling and open interior, caught whatever breeze existed. Tobias watched and waited and prepared. He stole lamp oil from the storage room, 1 bottle at a time, hiding them in the shed. He positioned the timber planks just so, leaning them where they could be grabbed quickly and wedged against the door. He practiced the movements in his mind: strike, drag, bar the door, light the fire. Strike, drag, bar the door, light the fire. He thought about Bess. About Elijah's ruined back. About eating from a dog bowl while white men laughed. About Miriam's tears. About 34 years of degradation and humiliation and watching people he loved suffer and die while he did nothing, nothing, nothing. On June 15, Tobias confirmed that all 3 men would be in the cotton shed on the evening of June 17. He overheard them discussing a major cotton sale, a deal that required all their presence to finalize. June 17, 1841. 2 days away. That night, Tobias couldn't sleep. He lay on his pallet in the kitchen and stared at the ceiling and felt nothing but calm certainty. Tomorrow would be his last full day alive. The day after, he would kill 3 men. The day after that, he would hang. He'd made peace with it. Some things were worth dying for. Some acts of resistance mattered even if they ended in death. He would take 3 devils with him, and perhaps, his name would be whispered in the quarters for years to come. Perhaps other slaves would hear his story and find some small comfort in knowing that once, one man had refused to endure any longer. Tobias Huckwell closed his eyes and saw fire. 2 more days. June 17, 1841 dawned clear and hot, the kind of Georgia morning where the sun rose like a furnace door opening and the air turned thick enough to choke on by midday. Tobias Huckwell woke before first light, as always, and went about his duties with the same mechanical precision he'd maintained for weeks. His hands were steady as he polished the breakfast silver. His face was blank as he served Master Cornelius his eggs and ham. He was invisible, unremarkable, exactly what a good house slave should be. Inside, he felt nothing. Not fear, not anticipation, not even hatred anymore. Just the cold, clear purpose that had sustained him since the root cellar, since the letter from Alabama, since the moment he'd understood that some cruelties could never be endured, only answered. The day passed in fragments. Morning duties. Afternoon heat. The sounds of the plantation continuing its brutal rhythms, the overseer's voice carrying across the fields, the crack of whips in the distance, the songs the field hands sang to mark time and maintain sanity. Life and death and suffering, all wrapped together under a merciless sun. Tobias made his final preparations with careful precision. During his afternoon duties, he carried lamp oil to the cotton shed under the pretense of refilling the work lanterns. He added it to the bottles he'd already hidden behind the cotton bales, enough to turn the entire structure into an inferno. He checked the timber planks leaning against the exterior wall, confirmed they were positioned correctly. He tested the iron poker used for stoking the fire pit, felt its weight, imagined it connecting with flesh and bone. At 6 o'clock, he served dinner to Cornelius, Wade, and Jessup Calloway. They were in good spirits, discussing the evening's business, a sale of 300 bales to a merchant from Savannah, a deal worth substantial money. They would finalize it in the cotton shed at 8 o'clock, where they could inspect the samples and sign contracts away from the heat of the manor house. "This sale will carry us through to harvest," Cornelius said, cutting into his roast beef. "Finest cotton in Spalding County, and Morrison knows it. He'll pay top dollar." Wade raised his wine glass. "To profitable ventures and well-run operations." They drank. Tobias poured more wine, his hands steady. After dinner, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Tobias made his way to the cotton shed ahead of the 3 men. He lit the fire pit, fed it kindling until flames leaped high. He arranged the lamp oil bottles where he could reach them quickly. He positioned the iron poker within easy grasp. His shoulder throbbed where Jessup had cut him in his mind's rehearsals, but that hadn't happened yet. That was still to come. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. At 7:30, Tobias returned to the manor house. He found Master Cornelius in the study, reviewing contracts by lamplight. "Master Cornelius," Tobias said, his voice appropriately deferential. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's a problem with the cotton in the shed." Cornelius looked up, frowning. "What kind of problem?" "I was lighting the fire pit for your meeting, and I noticed dark spots on some of the bales. Looks like it might be mold, sir. Could spread to the whole shipment if it's not addressed." Cornelius's face went red. "Mold? Impossible. Those bales were inspected last week." "Yes, sir. But the humidity's been terrible high, and..." "Where's Calloway? He should have caught this." Cornelius stood abruptly. "If Morrison sees molded cotton, he'll reduce his offer or withdraw entirely. Damn it. Mr. Calloway is already at the shed with Mr. Wade, sir. They asked me to fetch you. This was a lie. Wade and Jessup were still in the dining room, finishing their whiskey. But Cornelius didn't question it. Why would furniture lie? Show me, Cornelius demanded, grabbing his coat. They walked across the darkening lawn toward the cotton shed. The structure loomed ahead, firelight visible through gaps in the walls, smoke rising from the chimney opening in the roof. Inside, the fire pit roared exactly as Tobias had prepared it. Cornelius entered first, lantern held high, squinting in the smoke-hazed interior. Where? Which bales? In the back, sir. The far corner. Tobias followed him inside, closing the distance between them. Cornelius moved deeper into the shed, toward the cotton bales stacked against the rear wall. He was examining them, looking for mold that didn't exist, when footsteps approached from outside. Wade and Jessup entered together, responding to the same message Tobias had delivered separately to each, that the others were already in the shed, that the meeting was starting early, that there was urgent business requiring immediate attention. The moment all three men stood inside the cotton shed, Tobias moved. He struck Jessup Calloway first, the iron poker swinging in a vicious arc that connected with the back of the overseer's skull. The sound was wet and final, like an axe hitting a watermelon. Jessup dropped without a sound, his lantern falling and rolling across the floor, flames sputtering. Wade spun at the noise, his face registering confusion before comprehension before terror. Tobias was already moving, closing the distance, poker raised. Wade tried to draw back, hands up defensively, but Tobias drove the iron into his stomach with all the force of 6 months of planning and a lifetime of rage. Wade folded forward, gasping, blood on his lips. Cornelius ran for the door. He was fast for a man of his size, driven by pure survival instinct. But Tobias was faster, younger, fueled by purpose that transcended self-preservation. He caught Cornelius 5 feet from the entrance, tackling him to the floor among the scattered cotton lint. They struggled, Cornelius throwing wild punches, Tobias absorbing them without feeling them, his hands finding Cornelius's throat. "You killed her," Tobias said, his voice perfectly calm. "You promised she could stay. You sold her anyway. $800. She was worth $800 to you." Cornelius's eyes were wide, bulging, his face turning purple as Tobias's fingers crushed his windpipe. He clawed at Tobias's hands, leaving bloody scratches, but Tobias's grip didn't loosen. Behind them, Wade was crawling toward the door, leaving a trail of blood, one hand pressed to his ruined stomach. Tobias released Cornelius, not out of mercy but because unconscious wouldn't do, they needed to be awake for what came next, and turned his attention to Wade. He grabbed Wade by the collar and dragged him toward the fire pit. Wade fought weakly, his strength already draining away, blood loss making him lightheaded. The heat from the pit was tremendous, radiating in waves that made the air shimmer. "Please," Wade gasped. "Please, I'll give you anything. Freedom. Money. Your wife." Tobias lifted him. Wade Dunridge, who had made him eat from a dog bowl, who had engineered humiliations for entertainment, who had created suffering because he enjoyed it. Tobias lifted him to the edge of the brick fire pit and looked into his terrified eyes. "This is for Bess," Tobias said. "This is for Miriam. This is for Elijah. This is for everyone you ever hurt and everyone you ever would have hurt." He pushed Wade into the flames. The screaming started immediately, a sound beyond human comprehension, beyond anything Tobias had imagined in his planning. Wade thrashed in the fire, his clothes igniting, his hair becoming a torch, his skin blackening and splitting. The smell was obscene, burning hair, burning flesh, burning fabric all mixed together with the sweet acrid smell of cotton smoke. Tobias turned away from the pit. Cornelius had regained consciousness and was trying to crawl toward the door, coughing and gagging on the smoke that was beginning to fill the shed. Tobias walked over calmly and dragged him back toward the center of the structure. "You can't do this," Cornelius wheezed. "Your property. You can't. I'm not property anymore." Tobias's voice was empty of emotion. "Tonight, I'm judgment." He hauled Cornelius to his feet and began dragging him toward the fire pit where Wade's screams were finally diminishing, his body curling into a blackened, unrecognizable mass. Cornelius fought with everything he had, kicking and punching and biting, but fear had made him clumsy and Tobias was operating on something beyond adrenaline, beyond rage, beyond anything as simple as emotion. Behind them, Jessup Calloway stirred. Tobias had miscalculated, the blow to the head had stunned Jessup but not killed him. The overseer rose on unsteady legs, blood streaming down his face from the scalp wound, and pulled a knife from his belt. A long skinning knife he used for field work, for butchering animals, for cutting ropes. For killing slaves who got out of line. Jessup lunged. The blade caught Tobias across the shoulder, slicing through fabric and skin, cutting deep into muscle. Pain exploded through Tobias's arm, hot and immediate. He released Cornelius and spun to face Jessup. They grappled in the smoke-filled shed, two men fighting for their lives. Jessup was experienced in violence, had killed before, knew how to use a knife. But Tobias was fighting for something larger than survival, he was fighting for the meaning of his own death, for the legacy of this moment, for the story that would be told in the quarters for generations. He grabbed Jessup's knife hand and twisted. Bone cracked. Jessup howled and dropped the knife. Tobias caught it before it hit the floor and, without hesitation, drove it into Jessup's thigh, severing the artery. Blood sprayed in pulsing jets. Jessup collapsed, pressing both hands to the wound, but the blood kept coming, pooling on the floor. His pale eyes met Tobias's, and in them was pure disbelief. How could this be happening? How could property fight back? How could the natural order be so thoroughly inverted? "You made me whip Elijah," Tobias said quietly, standing over him. "You watched me destroy another man's flesh and you smiled." He picked up the iron poker and, with methodical precision, brought it down on Jessup's right leg. The bone shattered. Jessup's scream echoed off the walls. Tobias broke the left leg the same way, 2 swings, 2 breaks, efficient and terrible. Then he grabbed Jessup Calloway by the arms and dragged his broken, bleeding body toward the fire pit. Jessup was still conscious, still aware, still able to understand what was about to happen. His screams took on a new quality, not pain but pure terror, the sound of a man facing hell itself. Tobias rolled him into the flames beside Wade's charred corpse. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the shed. Tobias stood at the edge of the pit, blood running down his arm from the knife wound, smoke stinging his eyes, and watched Jessup Calloway burn. Cornelius Dunridge had reached the door. He threw himself against it with the last of his strength, but Tobias had planned for this. He walked calmly to the entrance, grabbed the timber planks he'd positioned, and wedged them against the door, barring it shut from the inside. Then he walked outside through the gap he'd left for himself, pulled the planks into final position, and sealed the shed completely. Inside, Cornelius's screams joined the chorus. He beat against the door, against the walls, his fists making hollow thumping sounds that grew weaker as smoke filled his lungs. Tobias could see him through gaps in the walls, illuminated by the firepit's glow, a shadow staggering and falling and rising again. Tobias poured lamp oil along the base of the shed's exterior walls. He lit it with a burning brand from the firepit's smoke hole. Flames raced along the oil trails, climbing the dry timber, spreading across the roof. The cotton shed became an inferno. Tobias Huckwell stood 20 feet from the burning shed and watched hell consume 3 men. The flames had engulfed the entire structure now, climbing toward the peaked roof in hungry orange tongues that licked at the night sky. The heat was tremendous even at this distance, a physical force that made his skin prickle and his eyes water. Black smoke billowed upward in thick columns, carrying with it the smell of burning cotton and timber and something else, something sweet and rotten and utterly obscene that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who smelled it for the rest of their lives. The screaming had stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had slammed a door on the sound. Whether smoke inhalation or fire or simple surrender had silenced them, Tobias didn't know and didn't care. Cornelius Dunridge, Wade Dunridge, and Jessup Calloway were dead or dying, and soon there would be nothing left of them but charred bones and ash. Tobias's shoulder throbbed where Jessup's knife had cut deep, blood soaking his shirt and dripping onto the dry Georgia earth. His hands were blistered from the heat, his lungs burned from smoke, his body trembled with exhaustion and shock. But his mind remained clear, crystalline, focused on what came next. He turned and walked toward the slave quarters. The field hands and house slaves had gathered in a loose semicircle 50 yards from the burning shed, drawn by the screams and the firelight. 43 souls stood frozen in the darkness, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, their expressions ranging from shock to horror to something that might have been satisfaction, might have been fear, might have been both at once. They parted before Tobias as he approached, creating a path through their midst. No one spoke. No one reached out to touch him. They simply watched as he walked past, blood dripping from his shoulder, smoke blackened and sweat-soaked, moving like a ghost through their ranks. Miriam stood at the edge of the crowd. She'd known. Perhaps not the specifics, not the exact details of his plan, but she'd known something was coming. Wives always knew. She'd seen the change in him after Bess died, had felt him withdrawing into that cold, quiet place where she couldn't follow. She'd held him at night and felt the absence of the man she'd married, felt him transforming into something else, something harder and more terrible. Now she looked at him with eyes that held no surprise, only infinite sadness. Tobias stopped before her. For a long moment they simply stood facing each other, the burning shed behind him casting his shadow across her face. Then she reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle despite the calluses from years of weaving. "I know," she whispered. "I know why." Those were the only words she spoke. The only words that mattered. Tobias didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The clarity that had sustained him through the planning and execution was beginning to fracture, and underneath it he could feel something vast and terrible waiting, grief, horror, the full weight of what he'd done. But not yet. He couldn't afford to feel it yet. He walked to the cabin he'd shared with Miriam and Bess, entered, and sat on the edge of their pallet. His hands, still steady despite everything, began to shake. The tremors started in his fingers and spread up his arms, his shoulders, his entire body convulsing with delayed shock. Outside, chaos erupted. The mistress of the house, Cornelius's wife Margaret, had been visiting her sister in Atlanta and was due back tomorrow. But the house slaves, the remaining overseers, the white men who worked the plantation's administrative functions all realized simultaneously that their world had just inverted. The masters were dead. A slave had killed them. Everything they believed about the natural order, about power and submission and control, had been shattered in fire and blood. Some ran for horses to fetch the sheriff from Griffin, 6 miles distant. Others formed a bucket brigade to prevent the fire from spreading to other structures. Still others simply stood and stared at the inferno, unable to process what they were witnessing. None of them approached the slave quarters. Not yet. Fear held them back, fear that this was the beginning of an uprising, that other slaves would follow Tobias's example, that the violence would spread like the fire itself. But the slaves in the quarters didn't move. They remained in their semicircle, watching the shed burn, their faces reflecting the flames. Some wept. Some prayed. Some smiled small, secret smiles they would never acknowledge in daylight. And some simply stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what Tobias Huckwell had done. He'd broken the fundamental rule of survival, he'd fought back. Miriam entered the cabin and sat beside Tobias on the pallet. She said nothing, did nothing except press her shoulder against his, her warmth a counterpoint to the trembling that still racked his body. Outside, they could hear shouting, the clatter of hooves as riders departed for Griffin, the roar and crack of the shed's final collapse. "They'll hang me," Tobias said finally, his voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. Tomorrow, or the day after. They'll make it public, make an example. I know. You should say you didn't know. Tell them I never spoke of it, that you had no warning. Protect yourself. I won't lie about you. Miriam's voice was firm despite the tears streaming down her face. Whatever you did for Bess. For all of us. I won't dishonor that by pretending ignorance. They sat together in the darkness while outside the world burned and died and prepared for retribution. The sheriff arrived 2 hours later with a dozen armed men. They found Tobias Huckwell sitting calmly on his pallet, his wound roughly bandaged with torn cloth, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't resist when they dragged him out. Didn't fight when they bound his wrists with rope. Didn't speak when they demanded confession. He simply looked at the smoking ruins of the cotton shed, now nothing but blackened timber and glowing embers, and nodded once. I did it, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd of slaves and white men alike. I killed Master Cornelius Dunridge, Master Wade Dunridge, and Overseer Jessup Calloway. I planned it. I executed it. I would do it again. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Rutherford, stared at him with undisguised hatred. Why? What possible reason? They killed my daughter. Tobias's voice remained calm, empty of emotion. They sold her to Alabama and she died 3 weeks later. She was 11 years old. Her name was Bess. That's no justification for murder. It's the only justification that matters. They threw him in a wagon and took him to the Griffin jail, a small brick building with 3 cells. They locked him in the smallest, darkest cell and left him there without food or water. Other prisoners, white men arrested for drunkenness or petty theft, were moved to different cells, as if Tobias's crime might be contagious. News of the Dunridge cotton shed massacre spread across Georgia like wildfire. Every newspaper from Atlanta to Savannah carried the story: slave burns 3 white men alive. Unprecedented brutality at Spalding County Plantation. The Dunridge horror. Plantation owners across the South read the accounts with mounting fear. If one slave could plan and execute such violence, what was to stop others? If the illusion of control could be shattered so completely, what did that mean for the institution upon which their entire economy depended? The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 3 hours. Tobias was not permitted legal representation, slaves had no legal standing to defend themselves. The prosecution presented evidence: the burned shed, the 3 sets of charred remains, the testimony of slaves who'd witnessed Tobias's confession. The defense presented nothing, because there was no defense. The judge, a plantation owner himself, delivered the verdict without deliberation: guilty of murder, 3 counts. Sentence: death by hanging, to be carried out in 3 days at the county courthouse square. During those 3 days, Tobias received a single visitor. Miriam arrived at the jail on the 2nd day, escorted by a white overseer who'd been hired to temporarily manage Dunridge Plantation. She was permitted 10 minutes in Tobias's cell, the overseer standing guard outside. She looked smaller somehow, as if grief had physically diminished her. Her eyes were red from weeping, her face gaunt from not eating. But her hands were steady when she reached through the bars to touch his. "The other slaves are calling you a hero," she whispered. "Saying your name like a prayer. Some of the field hands are saying they're not afraid anymore, that if you could do what you did, then anything is possible." "That's dangerous talk." Tobias gripped her hands tightly. "They'll be punished for it. Tell them to be careful, to keep their heads down, to survive. They won't listen. You changed something, Tobias. You showed them that we're not powerless, that the masters can bleed and burn just like anyone else." A sob caught in her throat. "But I'd trade it all, every moment of pride, every whispered story, every spark of hope you've given them, I'd trade it all to have you back." "I know." Tobias pulled her hands to his lips and kissed them. "But Miriam, listen to me. What I did, it wasn't heroism. It was rage and grief and desperation. It was a man who'd lost everything, striking back at the people who took it from him. Don't let them turn me into something I'm not. What were you then? A father. A husband. A man who loved his daughter more than his own life. His voice cracked for the first time. A man who failed to protect her. You didn't fail. They did. The system did. Every person who benefits from our suffering did. Miriam pressed her forehead against the bars. You're not the villain in this story, Tobias Huckwell. You never were. The overseer called time. Miriam was pulled away, her fingers sliding from Tobias's grasp. She looked back once, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear but understood anyway. I love you. I forgive you. Go to Bess. The hanging took place on June 23, 1841, 6 days after the massacre. They led Tobias Huckwell from his cell at dawn and transported him to the Griffin Courthouse Square, where a scaffold had been erected overnight. A crowd of several hundred had gathered, plantation owners and their families, poor whites eager for spectacle, even some slaves brought by their masters to witness what happened to those who stepped out of line. Tobias climbed the scaffold steps without assistance, his back straight, his head high. The rope was placed around his neck. A preacher offered him last rites and the opportunity to repent. Do you renounce your sins? The preacher asked. Do you beg God's forgiveness for the murders you committed? Tobias looked out over the crowd. He saw Miriam standing at the edge, tears streaming down her face but her chin raised in defiance. He saw other slaves from Dunridge plantation, their expressions carefully neutral but their eyes blazing with something that might have been hope, might have been grief, might have been the beginning of understanding that the world could be different than it was. I renounce nothing, Tobias said, his voice carrying across the silent square. I die a free man. They died slaves to their own cruelty. The trap door opened. Tobias Huckwell fell. His neck broke instantly, a small mercy in a life that had known precious few. They buried him in the potter's field outside Griffin, in an unmarked grave with the other criminals and paupers. No headstone. No ceremony. An attempt to erase him from history, to make him nothing more than a cautionary tale about slaves who forgot their place. But they couldn't erase the story. In the slave quarters of every plantation in Georgia, in whispered conversations after the masters went to bed, Tobias Huckwell's name lived on. The house slave who pushed masters into the fire pit. The Dunridge cotton shed massacre. The man who chose death over one more day of degradation. Some said his ghost haunted the ruins of the cotton shed, that on June nights you could still hear screams echoing across the old Dunridge property. Others said it wasn't ghosts at all but the wind through burned timbers, nature reclaiming what human cruelty had destroyed. The Dunridge plantation never recovered. Margaret Dunridge, widowed and childless, sold the property within 6 months. The new owner operated it for 2 years before abandoning it entirely. The slaves were difficult to control, prone to accidents and mistakes that cost money and productivity. The whispered name of Tobias Huckwell made every overseer nervous, made every master sleep a little less soundly. By 1850, the plantation was deserted, the manor house falling into decay, the cotton fields reverting to wilderness. The ruins of the cotton shed remained, a blackened scar on the earth that nothing would grow over, as if the ground itself remembered the fire and what it had consumed. Miriam was sold to a plantation in Tennessee 6 months after Tobias's execution. She lived another 30 years, survived to see emancipation in 1865, and spent her final decades telling anyone who would listen about her husband and daughter. About Tobias who polished silver. About Bess who practiced writing her name. About the night the world burned. Was it justice or was it murder? People would ask her in those later years, after the war, after freedom, when such questions could be asked openly. It was both, Miriam would reply, her old eyes distant with memory. And it was neither. It was a man who loved his daughter. That's all it ever was. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Tobias Huckwell's actions didn't end slavery. Didn't spark the rebellion some feared and others hoped for. Didn't change the fundamental power structures that would persist for another 2 decades until war tore them apart. But in the quiet moments, in the whispered stories, in the hearts of people who understood what it meant to be considered property, Tobias Huckwell mattered. He proved that the powerless could become powerful, even if only for one terrible night. That dignity could be reclaimed through violence when it had been stolen through violence. That some acts of resistance were worth dying for, even knowing they would change nothing. On June 17 each year, when summer heat made the Georgia air thick and oppressive, old folks in Spalding County would sometimes claim to smell smoke on the wind. Not wood smoke or tobacco smoke, but something sweeter and more terrible. Cotton and flesh and the bitter tang of revenge. And in that smell, if you listened carefully, you could hear 3 voices screaming. Not the screams of Tobias Huckwell's victims, though those screams had been real enough. But the screams of every soul who'd suffered under slavery's cruel hand, every mother separated from her children, every father forced to watch his family destroyed, every person reduced to property and told to accept it with grace. Those screams never ended. They echo still, through history and memory and the stories we tell ourselves about who deserves mercy and who deserves fire. Tobias Huckwell became both monster and martyr, depending on who told the tale. But he would have rejected both labels. He was simpler than that and more complicated. He was a man who loved his daughter. Who lost everything. Who decided that some things couldn't be endured, only answered. The cotton shed burned to ash. The bones were buried. The story lived on. Was this justice or murder? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more forgotten tales of horror from America's past.